Today is Monday, April 3rd. This is your Lake of the Ozarks fishing report for the upper lake area of Lake of the Ozarks. And this report is coming to you from Joe's Lake Ozark Guide Service. Right now the water level at Lake of the Ozarks, it has come up a couple feet from my last report. So we're sitting around 656, which is 4 feet below summer pool. Ameren, the people at Bagnell Dam, are going to raise the lake as of April 1st, a tenth of a day, depending on normal rain conditions. And they plan on getting the lake up to full summer pool by mid-May, or at least by Memorial Day weekend. The water temperature has been hanging around the low 50s right now. In the afternoons it can get up into the mid-50s, but when I look at water temperature, I pay really more attention to what the temperature is first thing in the morning. And then I look for just differences in water temperature based on whether I go into the back of a creek or whether I end hitting a main lake pocket this time of year. And then the water clarity of the upper lake area, it's still pretty dirty. My house is around 55 mile marker, so you can see down around 8 inches or so to a foot. If you move farther up the lake to 60, 70 mile marker, it gets a little dirtier. And then of course it gets clearer as you move down the lake, say to around 40 mile marker. I took a client out over the weekend who lives down around the 40 mile marker, 36 mile marker, and he said he could see around down about 2 feet on his house. So that kind of just gives you an idea of the farther up the lake you go, the dirtier the water's going to get. Now, how do you fish that differently than you would fish it if you had 3 foot of water visibility? The dirtier the water, the shallower the fish are going to go. Okay, and that's usually what's going to happen. So in the upper lake area right now, I mean, we're catching fish from 1 foot of water all the way down to 4 or 5 feet. We're really not fishing any deeper than 5 feet. So that's kind of what's going on here in the upper lake area. Because of the water clarity is a little dirtier, it's made the lure choice is pretty simple. I'm basically throwing 3 things. Of course, I'm always throwing a jig. I'll fish a jig 12 months of the year, but right now I'm fishing a jig on these channel banks or any type of isolated cover, logs, rocks, laydowns, and stuff like that I see. The only thing that I'm doing different on my jig, and if you want to know, I've had people say, what type of jig do I throw? I throw this Crocagator Zapper jig. It's just a really good jig. As you can see, the shape of the head, it goes through the brush really well and rocks. Has a really good strong hook on it, big wide gap hook, big bite on the hook. So it's a very, very good jig. It's probably the #1 jig on the lake. Chompers makes a very good brush jig too. So that's another good jig you could fish. On my crawl trailers, which is what I use in my jigs, are crawl trailers. When the water's below 50 degrees temperature, I go to more of a subtle type trailer, just a typical crawl. This is a Crocagator ring crawl, but this looks a lot like a Zoom critter crawl, you know, from what most people know of who aren't from the Lake of the Ozarks area. And then when the water temperature gets above 50 degrees, then I start going to more of an aggressive flapper type action. You can see the pinchers on this crawl they're just far more active, and when this thing goes through the water, those pinchers really flutter and fall. So as the bass get more aggressive, I get my more action into my crawl. If a cold front comes through and it cools the water down a little bit, then I might go back to this subtle type bait. Just almost kind of like you downsize a little bit. So that's what I'm doing on my jigs. The other thing we're catching fish on right now is the square bill crankbait. This is a Strike King 2.5. I do throw a Strike King 1.5. The bill's square. So anytime you have a bill that's a square bill crankbait, you want to be banging it into something, logs, rocks, whatever. Most of your strikes are going to occur on that. This bait will go 3 to 6 foot deep, roughly, depending on what pound test you fish it on. I usually fish mine on 14-pound mono. Whether you use mono or fluorocarbon, it kind of depends on the action of your rod. If the rod you're using is a lot stiffer, then you might want to go to a monofilament, because you can actually pull the hooks out of the fish's mouth with too stiff of a rod and line that does not stretch like fluorocarbon. If I'm using a real flexible limber rod, then I might go use fluorocarbon, because the rod will absorb a lot of the shock when a fish hits that. But having a lot of success right now on the square bill. Wiggle works work well up here too, although for me I catch more fish on the square bill because I think it runs a little shallower. I have trouble with a wiggle wart up close to the bank getting it hung up in some of the big rocks. Square bill seems to deflect off those rocks a little easier. And then the third bait we're catching fish on up here is a spinner bait. This is a War Eagle spinner bait, and as the water continues to clear, you know, you can throw these willow leaf blades. There it is. The bait we've actually been throwing is because the water's been dirty, is the spinnerbait that has the rounded Colorado blade. That's the bait. That's the blade we've been throwing, and that blade will thump more in the dirty water. And where I throw this is I don't really just use this as a search bait going down the banks. I kind of use the square bill for that right now. But if I go into the back of these creeks and look over on some flats and I see some isolated logs sticking up, that's right. That's where the big spinnerbait. That's where the spinnerbait really works the best up here in the Upper Lake area. So, in fact, there's a lot of guys that throw just a single blade Colorado spinnerbait on that. Right now, the biggest fish we've been catching have been about halfway back in these creeks, and they're located on the points that are leading into spawning pockets. Not really getting big fish in the back of the creeks. Been catching a few fish in the back of the creeks, but they're smaller. And on the main lake points, been catching some fish, but the bigger fish, the keeper-sized fish we've been catching, have been on these rounded or points that lead into these pockets where these fish are going to spawn. I haven't seen any fish on the spawning beds here in the 55-mile marker. I've fished from roughly 40 to 55 here the last week. Haven't seen fish on the beds here. I'm sure if you went farther up the lake, there might be some fish moving in on the beds, but the fish here right now are not on beds. I give us another week. I think we're going to have some on the beds. When they do move onto those pea gravel banks into those beds and stuff, that's when I start throwing a shaky head and I start throwing the Zoom trick worm. I'll throw that a lot in on the pea gravel. I'll also throw the jig and do that. Another bait I've been throwing, there's a lot of guys will ask if we throw a Carolina rig. The Upper Lake area, you can catch fish on the Carolina rig, but because the water's a little dirtier and there's just really not a lot of long sloping rocky points, it's not really that conducive to throw the Carolina rig. So one of the baits I throw is I'll throw the wobblehead jig, which is where the head of the jig, this is a football wobblehead jig, this is a biffle hardhead, and the actual bait, it'll actually pivot and swing. And how you fish this bait is you throw it out there, you let it sink to the bottom, point your rod at the bait or towards the bait, and just crank it like a crankbait. And you basically want this thing to just skip and on those rocks. And when that does, when this thing goes over those rocks, this bait's going to go back and forth. I have a swim bait on here, a Zoom fluke on here right now as a trailer. You can put any kind of trailer plastic on here. You can put plastic crawls on there. You can put creature blades. You can even put a Zoom trick worm on there. But as that thing wobbles through there, that hook is going to wobble back and forth and give that bait action. The reason why I've got a fluke on mine right now is I've been throwing a jig on the banks looking for the crawdad bite, and I mainly fish this in the middle of those spawning pockets. If the fish aren't up on the banks and they pulled out in the middle of those spawning pockets, whether someone sunk a brush pile there or there's a big rock there or something, I'll throw this thing and run this down through there. And this kind of gives the bass the two types of baits, forage that they're going to feed on this time of year. It gives them a crawdad and it also gives them a shad thing. So that's kind of what I do with that. We are getting really, really close throwing topwaters. Water temperature, like I said, is in the low to mid 50s. I'm saying in another week or so, and you could be even doing this by the end of the week, you can start catching fish on topwaters up here in the Upper Lake area. The one topwater I use in the spring the most is I'll use is a buzz bait. This is made by Crocagator, and it's called a head knocker. And what's ideal about this bait is the head is flat like a spoon. And so as you crank this bait on the water, it has a tendency, it will want to plane up and get on the water on the surface, and you can keep it on the surface. And I throw the big 3/4 ounce. Most people don't like to throw a bait that heavy, especially a buzz bait, because it'll start sinking on them real quick. But as you crank this bait, it wants to plane and get up on top. And this heavier Crocagator head knocker will actually plane up on the water better than the lighter weight head knockers, that is from what I've seen. And so I just put a trailer hook on here. I don't put any other kind of trailer on here, and I just cover water. Because the water's dirty up here, I'll throw black with a gold blade 99% of the time. The only time I won't might be on a really sunny day, and I might go to a white one with a silver blade, but I usually just stay with that. But you know, because the fish are shallow, if you catch one on a buzzbait right now, it's probably going to be a pretty good one. So that's what's going on in the Upper Lake area right now. As the lake continues to rise, I think it's going to pull more fish to the back of these creeks, and the bite is definitely going to get more aggressive. It'll get a little. As the bite gets more aggressive, you can start speeding up the cadence of your lures. So give me a call if you're interested in a guide trip. April's a fantastic month to fish the Upper Lake area. We got the Big Bass Bash coming up later in the month, and I'll do a separate big bass bash report when we get closer to that. So good luck in your fishing. Be careful when you're out there on the water. Take care. Thank you.